Hello and welcome again to the Foundations of American Democracy. Today we'll be looking at the Constitution and American civil liberties and civil rights. So what we'll be covering first is essentially what are civil liberties, which basically will explain its meaning, discuss how they differ from civil rights, and how the Bill of Rights protects individual freedoms from government interference. We'll also discuss major Supreme Court cases and debates involving religion, speech, privacy, gun rights, and the rights of the accused. When we get to the section on civil rights, we will cover the development of civil rights in the United States, focusing on the struggle for equality among African Americans, women, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, disabled individuals, and LGBTQ plus communities. We'll, of course, examine how political action, courts, and social movements expand equal protection under the law. So what I'm going to cover right now is, again, defining what is civil liberties, discussing distinguishing between civil liberties and civil rights, examining the first 8 amendments of the Bill of Rights, and understanding how civil rights protect citizens. Now, what are civil liberties? Now, civil liberties are freedom and protections guaranteed to individuals by the Bill of Rights and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Examples would include freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to privacy, and rights of the accused. So when you look at it, civil liberties protect people from government interference. Now, how are civil rights different from civil liberties? Now, according to much research, civil liberties are known as negative freedoms. They protect individuals from government action and focus on individual protections. Civil rights, on the other hand, are considered to be positive freedoms that guarantee equal treatment and political equality. And it will often focus on group protections. So when we look at it, civil liberties protect freedom from government, while civil rights guarantee equal treatment by government. So one thing I want you guys to get is that civil rights and civil liberties are not opposites, but actually complement one another. That we've seen in American history, without the struggle of civil rights, we the people would actually have fewer civil liberties. Now look at the expansion of civil liberties. Now originally, the Bill of Rights was only limited to the federal government. However, the 14th Amendment after the Civil War helped apply most constitutional rights to states through incorporation. So we found also that the Supreme Court gradually incorporated most of the civil rights during the 20th century. So here we have a breakdown of the 10 incorporation of the Bill of Rights based on the 14th Amendment. So we're going to look at some of these rights, starting with the right to privacy. Now, the Constitution doesn't explicitly mention privacy, but the Supreme Court interpreted from several amendments, including the 1st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 9th Amendment. Some major cases that helped to establish the right to privacy were Roe versus Wade, that protected abortion rights based on privacy. However, we know that this was recently overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. There's also Planned Parenthood versus Casey that reaffirmed important abortion protection. There was also Lawrence versus Texas that struck down anti-sodomy laws protecting same-sex privacy rights. And we see that based on these cases, that privacy rights remain highly controversial in American politics. Next, we have freedom of religion. Now, the First Amendment includes 2 religious protections. One, the Establishment Clause, where government may not establish an official religion, and the Free Exercise Clause, where government may not interfere with religious practice. Now, the Supreme Court uses what is known as the Lemon Test. And they developed this to determine whether government actions violate the Establishment Clause. So government action must have a secular purpose, neither advance or inhibit religion, and it must also avoid excessive government involvement in religion. So with that said, we see that the Constitution protects both freedom of religion and freedom from government-sponsored religion. Next, we'll talk about the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is considered essential to democracy. Now, protected speech in the US includes that of controversial things like flag burning, offensive demonstrations, and even political protests. There are, however, limits to freedom of speech. And these limits would include if it creates, or the speech creates, a clear and present danger, if it inhibits lawless, or it creates, imminent lawless action, and if it creates fighting words. So what we find is that freedom of speech protections are broad, but they're not absolute. Then we have freedom of the press. Freedom of the press receives a lot of constitutional protection, very strong constitutional protection. There's that of prior restraint, where courts are skeptical of government attempts to stop the publication before it occurs. And then there's also what we call the obscenity and the Miller test, where obscenity is not considered protected speech, and the Supreme Court uses the Miller test to determine obscenity, whether one, the average person finds it sexually offensive, if two, whether it depicts sexual conduct offensively, or three, whether it lacks serious value. Then the next right is that of the right to bear arms. This is the Second Amendment, or based on the Second Amendment, and it actually remains very controversial. A major case that strengthened this Second Amendment was McDonald versus Chicago. The Supreme Court revealed that gun ownership is an individual constitutional right. Then there are the rights of the accused. The Constitution strongly protects people accused of crimes through the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. These protections include protections against unreasonable searches, right to remain silent, right to legal counsel, protection from cruel and unusual punishment. Now, a major or important development was that between 1962 and 1968, the Supreme Court expanded protections for defendants. However, later, courts shifted somehow or somewhat towards law enforcement. And finally, we'll talk about civil liberties and national security. After 2001 and the terrorist attacks, debates intensified over balancing liberty and security. The major debate was looking at government surveillance programs like the NSA phone and internet monitoring, and that these programs raised questions about privacy and constitutional rights. We found a lot of themes of discussions were about how much liberty should citizens sacrifice for security. With that said, for our discussion on civil liberties, the main takeaway should be as follows: that civil liberties protect individuals from government interference, that the Bill of Rights became more powerful through the 14th Amendment, that free speech and religious freedom are central to democracy, that privacy rights are controversial and evolving, that the courts balance liberty with public safety and order, and that constitutional rights are constantly debated and reinterpreted. So we still find that civil liberties remain central to American democracy and public debate. Now we'll move on to the discussion about civil rights. Of course, under this section, what we'll be looking at is basically, explaining how groups won civil rights, explaining the African-American civil rights struggle, exploring women's rights movements, analyzing the experiences of minority groups, and discussing rights movements involving disability and the LGBTQ plus communities. Now, what are civil rights? We kind of differentiated between both civil rights and civil liberties not too long ago. But civil rights involve equal treatment, political equality, and protection against discrimination under the law. With that, we can see that civil rights movements seek inclusion and equality and equal opportunity in society. Now, there are actually said to be 7 steps to winning civil rights. This would include that, again, a group will gain equality through following this political process. That first, a group will define itself, the group challenges society, public narratives change, federalism becomes involved, the executive branch acts, Congress passes major legislation, and courts resolve disputes. So with that, we find that civil rights change happens through activism, politics, legislation, and the courts working together. Now let's look at equal protection and court review. Now, civil rights cases are usually judged under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. There are actually 3 levels of judicial review. You have the suspect categories where race and ethnicity receive strict scrutiny. You then have the quasi-suspect categories where gender discrimination receives intermediate scrutiny. And then you have the non-suspect categories where age, disability, and sexual orientation receive lower scrutiny. Now, looking at the African American civil rights struggle, revolt against slavery, we see that the fight over slavery has actually shaped American politics through abolition movements, economic conflicts, and political disputes over free and slave states. Now, some important historical developments were as follows. We had the Dred Scott versus Sanford case that actually deepened sectional tensions before the Civil War. We even had Abraham Lincoln redefining democracy as government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And then we also saw constitutional changes being had, where the 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection, and the 15th Amendment protected voting rights. Then we saw segregation and the development of the civil rights movement. We saw that after Reconstruction, segregation laws spread and the courts allowed discrimination. However, we saw greater fights for equality due to this. We had the NAACP that used legal strategies to challenge segregation, and we had the Brown versus the Board of Education going before the Supreme Court that declared school segregation unconstitutional. We also saw the passing of some major laws during this period. There was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed segregation and discrimination. And we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that protected voting access for African Americans. As you know, this was recently overturned in early May 2026. However, when these things happened, in fighting segregation, you saw where mass protests and changing public opinion pressured government institutions to act. Now, other achievements that we saw happening during the civil rights era was that in the 1960s and 1970s, we saw affirmative action programs attempting to address historical discrimination. You saw that those that actually benefited the most from this program were white women, where they're able to enter fields and even schooling that prior to that time, there was much difficulty. But it was really open to all minorities and other groups that faced discrimination. Now, the major debate during the affirmative action era, because much of that policy was gutted in the 21st century, is that you found that supporters viewed affirmative action as correcting inequality, while critics saw it as race-based policies and that it was unfair. Now, after the African American civil rights movement, we saw how women also had their rights expanded. So when we go back a little bit further, you found that women historically lacked political and legal independence. Some major achievements women got was the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that guaranteed women's voting rights. And they also benefited from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which also prohibited gender discrimination. Some ongoing debates when it comes to women's rights is Roe versus Wade, which you just mentioned was recently overturned. As we know, that actually made abortion rights a major political issue, which it still remains, but it's gone back to the states, and we've seen where each state have handled this very different. Then we also have the Equal Rights Amendment that generated major national controversy. Then let's look at the Hispanic Americans. You found that Latinos are one of the fastest growing groups in the United States and have organized around labor rights, segregation, and immigration issues. What we find is that political independence depends on collective political mobilization. And we've seen where our Latino Americans have done very well in this respect. Then we have the Asian Americans. Now, when we look at the Asian Americans, this is a very diverse group, from Indians to South Koreans to Chinese to Japanese, but they're very diverse. But they face a lot of stereotypes and discrimination as well. You found that the main idea with their movement is that they find that political effectiveness depends on coalition building and identifying shared interests. One of those was, again, the movements in striking down affirmative action, where they said that they faced discrimination in a way that it was based on stereotypes, that they were very smart, this and that, and they just want to make it equal across the board for especially those who wanted to go to universities. Then we have Native Americans. The Native Americans lost their land, political power, and cultural autonomy. It should be noted that they did not become U.S. citizens until 1924, but there is continued debate about whether to integrate into the wider mainstream society, or how do they go about preserving tribal independence. Now, as it relates to disability rights and LGBTQ plus rights, you find that with disability rights, activists pushed for inclusion and equal access through the Americans with Disability Act, and the LGBTQ plus rights. The movement gained momentum after 1969 and expanded rights involving military service, civil unions, and marriage equality. The main theme under these two groups is that we find that cultural acceptance and legal protections increased significantly, though debates continued. Or should I say continues. So the main takeaway from this section when we look at civil rights is that we should know that civil rights movements seek equality under the law. Courts, Congress, and activism all shape civil rights progress. African American civil rights struggles influence later movements. Social movements transforms laws and public attitudes. And we find that equality debates continue across race, gender, sexuality, and disability. With that, I want you guys to note that civil rights movements have reshaped American democracy, and they continue to evolve. Thank you.